welcome to Release the Creative, your favorite show about creativity, cognition, and today, the power of stories, part 2.
Part 2? What happened to part 1? Did we not finish?
Nah, we did. I mean, we certainly made some good points, but we ended up getting really talking about like marketing strategies, and don't get me wrong, that has a lot to do with the power of stories, but that doesn't get to the really... That's like starting in the middle of the textbook.
You're saying that we got off on a tangent? Is that what? That's outrageous.
That's outrageous. Nobody who's ever watched any of my podcasts or shows would think I'd ever get into a tangent. My last one, we actually had a tangent counter because it was live. Anyway, no, I want to talk about the power of stories, and not starting with like how to use them to manipulate your audience, but no, I mean like really the power of them and why they're so powerful. So I want to start off with a question.
Okay.
What's your favorite movie?
Well, you know, my favorite movie is Back to the Future.
Not exactly where I thought you were going to
what did you think I was going to say?
You're right. It's absolutely Back to the Future. I assumed you were going to say one of the Star Treks.
That would be an obvious choice, but no.
Yeah. So why Back to the Future?
Back to the Future is one of those movies that, besides it just is fun, but a lot of movies are fun. Back to the Future is one of those few stories where every single line in the script is there for a reason. And that seems obvious. Like, well, of course, everybody put a line in a script for a reason, but everything is said. It pays off later. You learn something. It's every thought, it either informs you about the character, and moves the plot forward, or it tells you something about the time and place that they're in. And there are a lot of movies where most of the movie does that, but there's a bunch of lines. It's like, you could cut that. It doesn't matter. And Back to the Future is one of those movies that if you were to go through and be like, what lines can you cut? It would be remarkably difficult.
So you're like an all meat, no potatoes kind of guy. That everything was there for, okay.
It's you never feel like you're wasting time watching that movie. Which some movies you're kind of like, well, they could have dropped this scene. It's not that important.
Okay.
But there's nothing in Back to the Future that you could cut. Anything that you suggest, I'd be like, yeah, well, if you cut that, it refers to this thing 30 minutes later. I'd have a.
Can you carry that through all the entire trilogy?
Not as strongly. Part 2 suffered from they didn't expect to write a sequel, and they were backed into.
Oh, really? I thought that the whole 3 was. I thought you and I have talked this before. Like they end part 2 with. Be continued.
Right, and that was a joke. It was like Saturday morning serials, like like how Flash Gordon and all those things. They always like come back next week for and so they ended part 1. It was just the same thing. It was like Doc and Marty are off on an adventure, and that was it. They were done. Zemeckis and I'm gonna make another movie. They were not gonna do a sequel, and then they were like, this movie exploded, and they're like, we've got to make a sequel, and they're like. Okay, so we ended the movie with them all flying into the future, and Jennifer's in the car, and we don't want any of that. So you notice the first thing that happens in part 2 is they fly into the future, land in an alley, put Jennifer to sleep, and leave her in the alley, and they leave her. Which, when I was a kid, that always struck me as kind of a weird, like, why did they just leave this character asleep in the alley? And like, they kind of worked it out and it fit. But the reason was they didn't want her in that part of the movie. They were stuck with her because that's how the first movie ended.
Okay.
So no, 2 and 3 is a little shakier. I like them a lot, but part 1 is a really solid, well-crafted sculpture.
Let's remember that you said well-crafted later, but science fiction's interesting. So would you say there's a point to Back to the Future? Is there a moral? It's not a heavy-handed like story at all. I don't mean that. I mean, like, what are you supposed to take away from it?
I think the most where the story came from originally was Bob Gale thinking, I wonder if I would be friends with my dad if I was the same age as him. That's where it came from, where it started.
Okay.
And so I would say that through the whole production, that kind of stayed, that the end message is, hey, these other people in your life that you kind of take for granted, they all have lives too. And maybe, don't just gloss over that.
No, that's actually really interesting. That I'm going to go Back to the Future again, because that's a very different thing. Stories are cool though, because so basically it was Bob Gale writing this story to dissect or explore this concept.
Yeah.
And stories are really cool like that, because you can now take me to Star Trek,
okay,
which I know that you've watched all of many times. And explain to me Star Trek if you had to, the concepts.
That's a very broad question because there's been 40 years of multiple shows and movies, but generally Star Trek is at its heart the purest form of science fiction, which is let's tell stories people aren't ready to hear in a way that's palatable to them. So
I like that.
That changes over time. In the 60s, they talked about racism by having aliens that looked different than humans. And,
right.
At that time, people didn't want to watch TV shows about black and white relations in America. Like a lot of Americans would have been angry about that. So we told them the same story, but through weird looking aliens.
Okay.
And then, as you get later into the 80s, they tackle different issues. There's an episode about, drug addiction and stuff. And,
Yes, there is.
And pretty much any issue. And that's what science fiction does best. And
well, yeah, I mean, even coming back to your Back to the Future example, you can never know if you would be friends with your father, but this story allowed you to explore that. And where science fiction, it's funny, I've heard there are countries in the world, and I don't want to say any of them because I'll end up being wrong that I chose the wrong country, but there are countries in the world that have actually outlawed science fiction. Like you can tell fiction, but science fiction is outlawed because of its power to make social commentary without making social commentary.
Yeah, that was the whole point behind Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone.
Right.
They dug very deep into social issues and
right.
issues that they couldn't have talked about in any other way.
Or like take modern Black Mirror. Every episode of Black Mirror, it's in a very near future-ish.
Yeah.
And every single one is specifically about, man, technology is jacked up. You should be really careful.
So they got a strong theme going there, but it's the same idea, yeah.
It's the same idea. And so all of these Twilight Zone and then The Outer Limits and so specifically science fiction, but not expressly, not only science fiction, but science fiction makes it really easy to do, is that by making a fanciful world, you are allowed to bend the rules and you can establish a world that looks really similar to the one you like, and then kind of go off with it. Like I've never been a huge science fiction fan personally, because I don't have an emotional attachment. I don't love technology in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I have a hard time getting emotionally kind of drawn in and connected to these worlds. Whereas I really love urban fantasy. Hate's really strong. I also, for the same reason, don't like Lord of the Rings, a Game of Thrones fantasy.
Yeah, medieval fantasy.
But I really like urban fantasy. I really like the Harry Potter series, and I really like everything written by Neil Gaiman. And I really like the entire the Jim Butcher Dresden Files, because it's urban fantasy. It's a world that has powers and abilities that aren't real, but it looks exactly like one that I know.
Yeah, people really break down the line between science fiction and fantasy, but to me, things like Harry Potter are more like Star Trek. It's the same thing. It's like, well, let's talk about Nazis and
right.
taking over the world and coming to power and feeling racism against groups.
Absolutely.
And that to me is a science fiction concept, but it's magic and castles. So
right.
people say, well, it's fantasy.
Right.
Okay. Well, maybe fantasy and science fiction aren't as different as we think.
I mean, I completely agree, but it's I've gone back and read the old Wizard of Oz books and things, and I can see the clear social commentary in these kind of fanciful worlds.
Yeah.
Where the minute I start getting into science fiction, it draws a boundary for me that it doesn't for everyone. But that technological future-topian thing immediately goes like, I don't know, man, computers suck. A world where computers are more integrated, I'm out. But Moulin Rouge, a world where everybody sings and dances and does absinthe. Awesome.
Yeah, well, that is the common theme for most stories I like are somewhat removed from reality. And there are certainly just normal dramas that I love these films. But,
sure.
But yeah, I'm always going to be a little more interested. And it doesn't have to be science fiction, but something that is different than the real world. Because to me, if we're talking about the real world, I'll you can read a book or watch a TV show. Or
right.
the fact that you've gone to all this trouble to make a movie, it's such a big thing. It's
sure.
like, let's build it up somehow.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we are at the first break in our show. Give us just a minute. We'll be right back, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why stories affect us in this way.
Hey, Jeff and I wanted to take a minute just here at the top of the show to say thank you for joining us on our new podcast and YouTube show, Release the Creative. Whether you're new to our brand of crazy or you followed us over from one of our other social media platforms, LinkedIn, Twitch, Facebook, or Twitter, we'd like to thank you for joining us here. please take this moment to hit the subscribe and the like button, and also that funny little notification button so that you can be notified of all our new episodes. We're really trying to get this new show up on the road. Thank you so much for watching.
All right, and we are back to Release the Creative. I'm Jeff, and this is Kirk. And we've been talking about movies, but we're talking about stories in general, and specifically how stories can affect you. And they're more than just facts. So, what is that? What makes a story instead of a textbook?
So that's actually really cool. Good way of phrasing that. So everyone, presumably, that is listening to a podcast has at some point watched a movie in a room full of people. Okay. In some capacity. Yeah. And movies in general have this really interesting ability. If you look at them and you think of yourself as like a caveman, no, that's a bad example. Think of yourself as someone who like completely disconnect yourself from the room and watch people watching a movie. Okay. And think about it. It actually gets really, really, really insane when you think about the completely to remove yourself, not just from the movie, but from the situation. And you watch and you'll notice that they kind of smile in tandem. They'll nod in tandem. They'll move forward and backward in tandem. They often will fidget in tandem. And they all kind of move together because this electronic signal on a wall across the room, or this projected light in the room that has nothing to do with them. There's no physical tact. The seats aren't moving unless you're at Disney World. You are just experiencing projected light across the room, and it is affecting people sometimes viscerally to their core. And TV does this. Books do this. Stories have this ability to kind of move people.
I think we're all familiar with, I know you're familiar with this, with the idea of if you have a movie or a TV show that is just like your favorite thing in the world, and you're introducing it to someone and they're watching it for the first time and you're in the room with them, and it's incredibly hard
not to watch them
because you want to just stare at them and be like, are they laughing at the same spots?
Like they damn well better be.
Did they get that joke?
You didn't seem to get that. Like, that's funny because of exactly.
And so it's very, very clear to see their reaction to the story, and you want it to go the same way that it was for you.
Right. And so things that we live immersed in this bubble. We are underneath the water of this bubble. We're like, well, no, we understand that this is a movie, but no, disconnect yourself from that. This is a story being told repetitively on DVD this is a story being told completely disconnected. It was told by someone else in another time in another place, and it has the ability, if in the right environment, to move you. And this isn't just about movies. The news does this. Symphonies. This isn't even movies anymore. This is pieces of music can do this in the right in the right environments. Stories have this ability to bring us from one place and bring us to another. And what's really fascinating is what they have found is that cognitively, the stories are actually one of the only things that can do that. There are obviously some exceptions, and takes some fuzzy edges of defining stories, because like I said, a piece of music can do it without lyrics, and depending on the person and the experience. But that largely comes from the same reason lots of people use sci-fi for social commentary, is that it allows us to affect these things. It allows us to build a world and establish a common ground. It allows us to paint a world that is just comfortable enough. And we can do that with non-science fiction. We paint a world that people understand, and you show them, and then you start introducing injustices, and you start introducing injustices, you start introducing and then the space aliens came. Like, whether it's meant to make you laugh or make you cry or make you react in any particular way, when you have an audience paying attention, you have their attention, you can play an audience like a video game. You can spark outrage, you can calm them down, you can lull them to sleep. And if you're watching Titanic in 1996, you can make them all weep uncontrollably.
Fun story. When I saw Titanic, movie theaters were sold out. Yeah. We were in high school. Yeah. And we went with a big group. I don't know, were you part of this group?
Probably.
Do you remember? we went to the movie theater, and this was, the 90s. They didn't have reserved seatings, and we went to like the show that started like half an hour after school got out or something.
We did often.
And so a lot of people got there like right away, and I think I took the bus or something. I got there later than everyone else, and so I remember like my entire peer group was somewhere near the middle of the theater in a group, and I had to sit in the very last row, and this was Springfield Mall. It was a long ways back, like row.
I worked at that movie theater.
Row, double C or something.
Yeah.
And I specifically remember I sat next to these two Egyptian guys, and I don't know, they must have talked to me or something. I don't know how I knew they were Egyptian, but a very strong memory of knowing that. And
they
so
were from Egypt. Okay.
I hung out with them for the 3-hour runtime, and I think they said like goodbye at the end of the movie or something. Kind of had hung out with these guys. So that's my Titanic memory. Just to see, I have a story about your story.
No, and the thing is that like I've always been like a story addict, and I saw Titanic several times in theaters. I don't know that I was at that particular one, but I went with you on those group things a lot. But I saw Titanic several times. My point is that I worked at movie theaters for over a decade, and one of my favorite things to do when I was an usher, which I'd worked every job at the movie theater, but one of my favorite things to do was to stand and watch people coming out of a movie and just check what percentage of them walked out the same. Like, if they were crying, was it all of them? Was it one crazy person? Was it, and for the most part, 80% were walking out
with a similar
countenance, whether they were happy or sad. And that is a true power of the ability to establish a message, establish a world, establish ground rules, and then pull someone along. Now, a lot of this comes from what I call adaptive mythology. I didn't come up with that term, but it's the ability for people to place themselves in a world with rules with other people. Like, hey, let's both agree that that's the leader now, and we're going to listen to them. Or, and so we have, a general one day is commanding troops, and the next day he's at a concert, and some 16-year-old is saying, sir, you can't come through here. And like one day he's saying, kill that dude. And the next day he's saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'll go the other around. That's adaptive mythology. Like one day it's situational. Exactly. But what starts to happen is we have this thing that everyone's kind of heard of, but not everyone knows what it means. We have like cognitive dissonance. When we believe one thing, we know one thing, and then we believe this other thing, and we know this thing. There's these two pieces of mythology that contradict each other. And they contradict each other. And so we have to come up with these like weird stories that like
make it work.
Make it make sense. Like smoking is bad for you, but I smoke. No, I don't, Mom. I don't smoke. But like smoking is bad for you, but I smoke. But that's because I only smoke light cigarettes and on Wednesdays. Or like, you see these people equivocate, or they make up these exceptions that because cognitive dissonance is super uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And the thing is that you can't rely just on facts, because you'll have this thing that you believe very strongly and this thing you believe very strongly, and they directly contradict. So you have to come up with something that makes those two things work. And that is the world of modern marketing. Is we have all these people with adaptive mythologies, and we have to set a stage that we can get them all on together, and then bring them in a way that, even though these people are coming from this side and these people are coming from that side and these people are coming from over there, we're going to bring them together in a way that makes them all see this one point that may or may not contradict with other things they believe. And it's
you're playing in the numbers.
you're playing a dangerous game. And it's all based on strategic storytelling and the ability to understand the semantics, the syntax, and the emotions of how the brain actually works and how you can affect that adaptive mythology.
All right, so semantics, syntax, emotion.
Right.
Stuff that's all in your brain.
Correct.
All right, we're taking a break.
Absolutely.
I want to hear all about that when we get back.
Cool.
All right, and we are back for the last third of our episode. This is Release the Creative with Kirk, and I'm Jeff. We're talking about stories, and more specifically, the brains.
Now we're talking about the brain.
About the brain, Kirk.
So we've talked about, the power of stories. We talked about Back to the Future and all of these sci-fis and fantasies that they allow you to tell these complicated moral tales with some degree of fancifulness. And then we talked a little bit about cognitive dissonance and how but really that's all messaging. All of it, 100%. Whether you're in one of the things that gets me in a lot of trouble with my colleagues is that I maintain that whether you are making a movie or whether you work in the WWE or CNN, it's all just storytelling. Yeah. It's the exact. You're a reality television show producer, no matter which one you do. PR, marketing, movie making, same exact thing, because they all follow the same principle. I need to establish a world that you agree exists. What's funny is that people on the left side and the right side of the aisle currently don't agree that the real world they both live in
is the same.
So the first thing we have to do in messaging, whether you're telling a story, whatever, we have to establish that we both live in a world that we agree on. Mm-hmm. We have to hit knowledge. Then we have to hit that attitude we talked about last week, and then we have to hit that knowledge that we talked about last week, the behavior, or the attitude, and the behavior. But what's funny is what I wanted to get into is how this is actually all rooted back to the brain. So you've heard of the lizard brain.
Yeah, that's the part of your brain that makes you jump when you're scared. Like right. You don't think about it. You don't hear a noise at night and think, I think I will jump now. It just happens.
Yeah, the lizard brain or the limbic system is the oldest part of the brain. It's right around the brainstem. It's the fear center. It's more or less the emotional center, but what handles most fear. It handles when you say, I don't know, but I feel it in my gut.
That's lizard brain.
That's your lizard brain. You're like, you know what? I am irrationally afraid of X. I'm irrationally afraid of Y. Like I have never liked that person much. I just don't like them there. I don't feel right. That's the limbic system.
Okay.
And you can affect the limbic system in a couple of ways. And then once we get into the newer brain, we have these two other parts. We have more or less concepts, let's call them semantics, because that's what they're called. Lots of times you'll hear people arguing, well, that's just semantics. And what they mean is lexical semantics, which is you're using two different words that describe the same concept. Good and great. Well, that's just semantics. Sure. But semantics are concepts, up, down, left, right, happy, sad, even though the reality of those is the limbic system. Those words, those concepts are words to describe these things.
It's what lets you actually
express them,
think about these concepts, right, and communicate them.
And then you have the syntax, which is the ability to string them together. And the reason those three things, without getting super boring like Bueller, the reason those things are really important is the mixture of the three: the limbic system, the expression of emotions, the syntax, the ability to create a form, and the semantics, the concepts that we can all agree on. Though that is storytelling. I can now establish a world with semantics. I can establish a world that we can agree on. This is wood. There was this desk. I can establish known concepts that we can agree on with semantics. Then using syntax, I can work through a structure. And if I do this very, very correctly, I can start to affect the limbic system. I can start to affect how you feel about them. So that's the knowledge, the semantics, the attitude, the emotions, and then the syntax, the behaviors.
So affecting the limbic system, is that really the goal of every story?
I wouldn't
or is it a
say,
byproduct?
Yes. It goes back to last week. Are you trying to affect knowledge, attitude, or behavior? If you want to affect someone's knowledge, you don't need the limbic system. All you have to do is teach them something. All you have to do is give them information. Mm-hmm. If you want to affect their attitude, you're going to start having to change how they feel about it. And then once you've affected how they feel about it, you still are going to have to go the next step to get them to act on that, which is a different section entirely. Mm. The point here is that, we talked a little bit before the break about cognitive dissonance. This is kind of how you play with that. You have to be able to I can come to you and say, be mad at that person, but you're not going to. I can come and say, you should be happy. It's a beautiful day. But it's like the people that say, calm down. Right.
That doesn't work.
That doesn't work. Don't look down. Like saying calm down, or will you calm down, or that's you can't bring your brain just words don't bring your brain from one state to another. Stories do. Back to the movie theater. You can sit and watch people coming out of the movie theater and a well-crafted story, or watching the news with people of political affiliation. It enrages them together. It pacifies them together. It hell yes them together. Stories unite because it's this adaptive mythology. It's this ability to unite people's knowledge. You know, we have established a world that we can all agree on, like science fiction. Okay, magic is real. I'm in. And now we start affecting the attitude, but you know, there's these people and they're racist against mudblood. So like, now I start to, and we can start affecting the way you feel, and I can start adapting people's behaviors and their mentalities by setting a stage and moving the pieces around it. And the cool thing about stories is it's literally the only thing that can do that.
That's, sounds wrong, but I can't think of an example, so I guess...
I mean, our parents can tell us a million times, this is your curfew, don't stay out too late. Your boss can tell you, until something has affected those three things, until a world has been presented that you agree with, you're going to lose your job. You're like, well, that's not a story, that's a fact. Right, but you have to believe it. If everyone comes back from work late, everyone takes 2-hour lunches, and your boss says if you take a 2-hour lunch you'll be fired, you don't believe them. That's information without consequence. That's the story. And yes, stories can be fictional or non-fictional until something feels real, until there's a world that we can agree upon, and a set of consequences. Until we can agree on these boundaries and rules, then we're all. But that's what messaging is. It's if I can convince you that things weren't that bad, or things were that bad, or things that are worse than they are, if I can make you afraid, if I can make you happy, sad, or indifferent, we can change how you look at a problem, or we can change your behavior. We can change everything. I mean, that's what propaganda was. It was painting the world in a different way.
So how do you know if you're trying to write a story, you're like, I'm going to write a movie, then it's very obvious you're writing a story. But let's come back to something that is communication, but not a story. Let's say you are writing a report to present at work for some kind of program that you want to advocate for, and you're going to give a presentation, and you have your PowerPoint, and your PowerPoint lays out like, well, if we set up the third floor as the intake system for the mailroom, we're going to save $34,000 a month, and you're like, great, I've got this fact, I'm going to go present this to the board of directors.
Awesome.
Like, the meeting's tomorrow, you're looking at your PowerPoint, you're like, all I have is this fact that's going to save money. Like, what steps do you take?
Oh my gosh, such a good question. Okay, so you have this fact. You need this thing. Presenting a fact will never move the needle. Presenting a fact, coming in and just saying, there's a lot of padding around this example, but if you come in and you say, this is costing a lot of money, okay, there's no so what there. Yeah. The way you move that needle is to make it a story. And I don't say you come in and you say, I remember when I was a child. I'm saying that present tense real life can still be narrativized by coming in and expressing, here are the facts, and here's why it matters, and here's what we do about it, and here's how we all conquer the world. That is how we can move people from one frame of mind to another. Now, if your boss is going to agree with you, there's no reason to do that.
Yeah, I guess my example is more for the person who is like, this is an uphill battle. I have facts on my side, but nobody cares.
You have to make them care, and the way you make them care.
This is the way you do that.
Right. If everyone's going to agree with the fact, you don't need a story. You just like, it's the news on left or right leaning. You throw the fact out, and they'll eat it up anyway. It's fine. Or you let the opinion. It's when you start doing like, these people are not going to agree with this thing, or I need to sell this product that nobody is going to want because they're all happy with this other thing, or I want to make people laugh and they're all in a bad mood. Okay. Knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors set the stage, establish the world that you want them to be in, and bring them in. Establish this thing, and you can move the needle accordingly. And that's how you sell any product. That's how you make people laugh, cry. That's how you get your plan approved, is by establishing the ground rules of the world. Magic is real. And I mean, it really can be. We are going to make $1 billion next quarter. I roll. And here's how. And you establish a world they want to believe in, and you set the stage with things they don't think are ridiculous, and then you explain to them how things work in this world and they can join it too, and then on book 7 you find out that Harry Potter wasn't really all that special and you're destroyed. But that's storytelling. You draw them in by establishing a world they want to believe in and setting the rules in a way that they believe that it could, and then that's when the magic starts to happen, and that's strategic storytelling.
Okay, well, that's what we're here to talk about in general. We will pick up next week. We are out of time right now, but yeah, in general, I guess the conclusion here is we're all so used to hearing stories, and some people don't think they can tell them, but it's just not true. Everyone can tell stories.
Everyone can tell stories, and stories are way more important. And a lot of people, the Peter Pans grow up and they're Mr. Darlings, and they're like, once when they need to grow up and be practical. And there's nothing more practical than knowing how to tell a story.
Love it. Well, we will see you all next week. I am Jeff, this is Kirk, and this is Release the Creative. Thanks for joining us here at Release the Creative. Kirk here would never say it to your face, but he thinks you should like and subscribe to us on YouTube.
And Jeff is far too shy to admit it, but he thinks you should subscribe to us on your favorite podcast reader.
Yeah? Well, you're the one who's always saying that everyone should give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
Why do you have to make everything so difficult?
Do you think it's been 30 seconds yet?